Starting this page has motivated me to do a couple of things. One, go outside less, and two, read a couple of mangas that I've been putting off for a good amount of time now. And one manga that I've been putting off for a good amount of time is Bleach. See, Bleach's final arc is coming out in a couple of days. October 10th is when it's going to begin to air in Japan, and this arc is known as the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. And with Studio Mappa animating this arc, there is as much hype around Bleach as well there ever has been. And thus I figured it's about time we master Bleach. And let me tell you, after switching from the anime to the manga, I am a fan. But what I've realized about Bleach, specifically the manga, is that the power system is a bit confusing. There's a lot of words that are very Japanese. However, those words are relatively similar to each other, and for some reason those words that are similar to each other seem to do similar things, but they're used interchangeably, and it had me sitting there wondering what the true difference between all of these things were and how power is assessed and or used in the Bleach universe. And so I sat down and did my research, as I do, and I figured it out. But I'm fully aware that there's a high possibility that a lot of you who have watched Bleach haven't seen an episode or read a panel in years. But now you're about to jump directly back into TYBW, 1,000-Year Blood War. So let me save you from some confusion in the first couple of episodes of TYBW and explain to you today spiritual power, also known as Ryoku. And while it's used to a small degree by every single living being, it's largely used by Shinigamis or Soul Reapers. But even right now, we're already running into our first misconception because a lot of people believe that spiritual power only exists within Shinigamis, well, and Hollows and Arankars and Bounce. But what people fail to realize is that every single living human on Earth has spiritual power, because every single living being has a spirit. And spiritual power is the power and will of said spirit. However, most humans don't know how to strengthen their spiritual power, because for the average human, in order to strengthen your spiritual body, you would have to separate your mortal body from your spiritual body. Now, we've obviously seen people like Kisuke do this to Ichigo in order to help Ichigo differentiate his mortal body from his spiritual body. The problem is most people's mortal body is significantly stronger than their spiritual body, and therefore upon the two being separated as their consciousness resides in their spiritual body, they'll feel incredibly weak. And only by doing things like fighting or training while in their spiritual body form can they increase the spiritual power of said spiritual body. Now, of course, in the circumstance of humans, there's some other problems with separating your spiritual body from your physical body. When a human separates their physical body from their spiritual body, they're connected with a thing called the chain of fate. Now, this is a chain made out of spiritual energy, and as long as your spiritual body is still connected to your physical body, the two can come back together. But should your chain get severed, the spiritual body can never return to the physical body, unless of course a Shinigami uses a healing keto that can allow the soul to return to the body with a severed chain. But those are rare circumstances. Now, what happens if your chain is severed? Well, it's a problem, because after your chain becomes severed, it begins to encroach. That is to say, slowly but surely your chain of fate evaporates from your chest. And should your chain encroach all the way to your chest and disappear entirely, the human soul becomes a hollow. Now, are humans the only people who have to worry about chains of fate? No, not really. See, Shinigami also have chains of fate, but in a kind of different way. See, a Shinigami has kind of two different chains of fate. They have a Saketsu, also known as a binding chain, which is the place where Shinigami's chain of fate used to be. But remember, Shinigamis are just souls and therefore have no physical body and therefore have no need for a chain of fate. And this Saketsu, aka this binding chain, can be used to boost the spiritual power of a Shinigami. But the Saketsu is kind of like a temperature control in a shower, in that it only controls the spiritual power from the Haku Suite, also known as the Soul Sleep. You see, the Soul Sleep is the source of spiritual power for a Shinigami. Kind of like how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. This area which exists physically on the body in a specific location, specifically in the region of your collarbone, and the binding chain area, which is located on your chest where your old chain of fate to be, are considered pressure points. And that technically they can be manipulated within combat. They can be opened for extra power or pierced. See, these two things operate much like vital organs. One very good example of this is when we saw Captain Kuchiki use Senka against Ichigo. To not get into the weeds of what Senka is and what Shunpo is, we'll just say Captain Kuchiki cut these 2 points on Ichigo's body with his sword. And since these two pressure points operate much like vital organs and therefore shouldn't be cut, having these two areas severed on his body cut Ichigo off from all spiritual power. So by cutting these two areas, you cut somebody off entirely from ever accessing spiritual power again, thus basically ending their career as a Shinigami. So now that we've done a basic intro to spiritual power and what it is, let's talk about what spiritual power gives you. See, humans who have spiritual power usually have the ability and only the ability to see supernatural things, like Shinigamis and Hollows. While Shinigamis who have an unnaturally high amount of spiritual power compared to humans can forge that spiritual power into combat abilities. Now there's 6 classifications to what your spirit power level is: basic, average, high, great, immense, immeasurable. We'll go through those quickly. So a basic spiritual power level is basically your average human. They may be able to see hollows, they may not be able to see hollows, but they sure as hell cannot form spiritual power into offensive or defensive attacks. Average spiritual power is basically what Ichigo was in the beginning of the show. Essentially, you are highly spiritually aware. You are able to sense spirits, see spirits, and possibly form your spiritual power into attacks, or simply use your spiritual power to boost your own physical abilities, which is why Ichigo was so supernaturally strong. So any humans that can basically see all pluses, Shinigami or hollows fall into this categorization, but also the weakest of the Shinigami also fall into this categorization, because the weakest of the Shinigami can't really even awaken their own Zanpakuto. They're just dudes who can see hollows with swords. Having high spiritual pressure is usually what we see out of our lieutenant class. These are the people we see with the ability to awaken their Zanpakutos and fight at a relatively high level, while great spiritual power level usually is associated with captains and those who can release Bankai. But the immense spiritual pressure rank is a bit intimidating. This is what we like to call the advanced captain class. And by advanced captain, we mean people who can use spiritual power to enhance their own physical abilities, but also control the environment around them. Think Kaname Tosen's Bankai, where he creates a black void within a black dome that people lose all of their senses in. With this Bankai, Kaname is controlling a controlled area in a controlled fashion, taking the sensations of feeling spiritual pressure, sight, scent, sound, everything from everybody within this area, but from himself, leaving everybody within his Bankai with only the ability to feel. By controlling an area and boosting his powers with spiritual power, he has become advanced captain class. And then there's the immeasurable spirit power class, which just means you're basically impossible to quantify. Aizen, Ichigo, you get it. But one of the senses that Kaname took away was the ability to sense spiritual power. Now, for those with spiritual power, this is essentially their 6th sense. However, you don't technically sense spiritual power. Spiritual power is generated within your soul. It is the energy that makes your soul more powerful. You don't sense that. However, some of your spiritual power is emitted out of your body. And this spiritual power that leaves your body and can be sensed is Ryatsu. Ryatsu is also known as spiritual pressure. And spiritual pressure is a bit like what it sounds like. It's the amount of pressure that your spiritual power suppresses onto others. While spiritual power is potential, spiritual pressure is spiritual power in use. Think of it like this. I could have 100 bullets on the ground, but I have a magazine that only holds 10. My spiritual pressure will be those 10 bullets that are in the magazine in said gun, but my spiritual power is the 100 bullets I could use later. Now, spiritual pressure leaves Shinigamis from their wrists, specifically vents in their wrists, like they're Spider-Man. And if you block up these vents, a Shinigami will actually be incinerated from the inside out by their own spiritual pressure. If you ask me, there's a lot of ways to kill a Shinigami. It's like collarbone, chest, or wrists. But spiritual pressure is really important because, one, spiritually aware people can track other people using their spiritual pressure, using Raikaku, also known as spiritual sense. And this spiritual sense can allow you to track certain people's spiritual pressure even through crowded environments. And by tapping into this spiritual sense, it's kind of a bit like Spidey sense, in that anybody with spiritual pressure sees with not only their eyes, but also their spiritual sense, using both simultaneously by being able to track somebody by sensing their spiritual pressure, but also looking at them with their eyes. Spiritual pressure is a lot different from different power systems like Nen or Chakra, because spiritual pressure, after it's released from a Shinigami or a Hollow or a Quincy, always returns. That's not to say it's regenerated like blood. No, it seeps out into the atmosphere as it's being released in combat, but eventually comes back. And this is because spiritual pressure is made of Reishi. You see, human bodies are made out of things like carbon and iron and nitrogen, but spiritual bodies and everything in the spirit realm is created using Reishi. You see, Reishi is kind of like a meta material. That is to say, souls, hollows, and Shinigamis are all made of it, which is why they're invisible and intangible to regular humans. Because those who are not spiritually aware can't see and or interact with Reishi. People like Quincy's and Fullbringers are obviously an exception. But Reishi is in everything, in the human world, in the spirit world, everywhere, which is why Quincy's are able to gather Reishi into things called spirit weapons, the bow and arrows they use, or the swords they manifest. But also the reason that Shinigamis are able to stand in the air is because they can gather Reishi under their feet in order to float. And Reishi can be used in way more ways than just making a bow, a sword, or floating, but we're doing a basic dive today, not a complicated one. However, since we're talking about Reishi and spiritual density, there's also a thing known as spirit class, which is a different kind of rating system than the one we stated earlier. You see, rating class is kind of like a power ranking for those who are able to use spiritual pressure. It's a number system that goes from 1 to 20. The more dense your Reishi is, aka the stronger you are, because the more Reishi you can manifest, the more spiritual pressure you can put out, and the higher your spiritual power is, the lower your number is. So while lieutenants in the Gotei 13 usually fall in the 4 to 6 range, captains, depending on their strength, usually fall in the 1 to 3 range. The problem is Reishi is slightly magnetic. That is to say, the denser the Reishi gets, the harder it is to separate. And this is a problem. You see, because after you die as a Shinigami or a Hollow or an Arankar, your Reishi disperses into the atmosphere and is recycled. Much like how if a regular person dies, they get put in the ground, their body decomposes, and they become nature. However, for people classes 3 and up, their Reishi is too dense to disperse. And thus when they die, their body won't just burst into Reishi and go back into the Soul Society. Their body just stays, which means that there is just a body made of incredibly dense Reishi that could be absorbed by somebody trying to do something evil, which is very dangerous to the Soul Society. So what happens when a captain dies? Well, something named a Konso Risai needs to happen. This is a process where 12 years after a captain's death, a bunch of captains and lieutenants go out and capture a hollow. They then purify the hollow on the gravesite of the dead captain, saying that this purification process will allow the captain's Reishi to finally dissipate. However, this isn't the case. In fact, this process actually just sends the captains that have died to hell. Yes, there is a canonical hell in Bleach. And it's the place that hollows and Arankars once purified will go if they were wicked humans. And while this does technically get rid of the incredibly dense Reishi that's left over by a captain's body, it also sends a captain to hell to live in pain for the rest of their lives. So becoming a captain is a bit of a double-edged sword, but fortunately they live for almost ever, so unless they die in combat, they don't have to worry about that. But since we're talking about combat, basically the only time that somebody's spiritual pressure will change is if they are in combat or if they've been gravely wounded. See, those who are talented in tracking spiritual pressure can sense their friend's personal spiritual pressure from far away. They can assess the mental and or physical state of their friend by reading this spiritual pressure. Your spiritual pressure output is also dependent upon whether or not you are a plus, a hollow, a Shinigami, or an Arankar, as the spiritual pressure of all these different beings is different and therefore is sensed differently. Now, there is ways to shut off spiritual pressure entirely. Seki rock is usually the best example for this. Seki rock is a specific kind of rock that blocks all spiritual pressure output. That is to say, it doesn't matter whether or not you're firing a Kido or simply just trying to slash at the Seki rock with a spiritual weapon, the Seki rock will block it entirely. Think of it like a sea prism stone. And here's the thing, us regular humans might want to keep some of that Seki rock on us because spiritual pressure can kill. Spiritual pressure is a bit like Conqueror's Hockey. If somebody with immense spiritual pressure walks past you and you don't have that much spiritual pressure, you can faint or straight up just die. The pressure of their spiritual pressure can be so much greater than your spiritual pressure that it can literally wipe out your soul spirit to live. And the truly dangerous bit about this is those with immensely high spirit pressure actually usually don't have their spirit pressure even sensible by those who have less spirit pressure. That is to say, if my spirit pressure is immeasurable and yours is average, you wouldn't even sense my spirit pressure because it would be so much greater than yours, which is all fine and dandy. I guess you won't be afraid of me, but you probably should be, because if I come into contact with you or even just come particularly close to you, you'll die. We've seen this from Aizen after his second fusion with the Hogyoku, when his spiritual pressure was so immense as he walked past a person, the person just up and died. And a very similar thing happened after Ichigo finished his Dangai training and was fighting Aizen. Aizen scoffed at him because he couldn't feel any spiritual pressure coming from him, which led Aizen to the conclusion that Ichigo had forgone all spiritual pressure and converted it into muscular mass. But in reality, Aizen's spiritual pressure was so much lower than Ichigo's, he couldn't sense it. But enough about sensing spiritual pressure. How do you use spiritual power? Obviously, we've already talked about the formation of spirit weapons by Quincy's using Reishi, but Reishi is what comprises spiritual power. And thus the way Quincy's use Reishi is kind of a watered down version of what Shinigami do. So those who are able to use spiritual power like Hollows, Arankars, and Shinigami can stem the flow of their spiritual pressure from their wrists. Now I know I said earlier that if you block off these vents in the wrist, that a Shinigami can burn themselves from the inside out with their own spiritual pressure. However, Shinigami can elect to close these vents in order to make sure that they are untrackable, or to divert their spiritual power less into spiritual pressure and more into weapons. And these weapons can manifest as pretty much anything. They can manifest into supernaturally strong arms, like with Chad, or hair clip fairies that can control the concept of actions and consequences, like with Orihime. But this level of high diversity is usually specific to humans, because humans aren't trained as Shinigami, and therefore they apply their spiritual power in different ways than Shinigami. See, Shinigami tend to focus their spiritual power into three separate things. Kido spells, which is basically like magic. There's 100 Kido spells that vary in strength from 1 to 100, with 1 being the weakest and 100 being the strongest, which is dumb if you ask me, because Spirit class 1 is the strongest and 20 is the weakest. Just keep it consistent. And Kido spells can be anything from a binding technique to a giant blast of energy. Outside of Kido spells, Shinigamis also use something called Ho-Ho, which is using your own spiritual power to boost your speed and agility. I'm sorry, earlier I said there's 100 Kido. That's not true. Kido is a catch-all term for magical spiritual power art. There's 100 Bakudo, which are defensive Kido, and 100 Hado, which are offensive Kido. And then there's a bunch of healing Kido, but we don't know how many of them there is. Sorry, maybe I didn't do enough research. Back to Ho-Ho. It's increasing your movement speed and agility, and it's considered one of the 4 principal arts of fighting as a Shinigami, which are Zanjutsu, which is sword fighting, Hakuta, which is martial arts hand-to-hand, Ho-Ho, the movement arts, and Kido, magical arts. Now, obviously, all 4 of these arts require spiritual power, and all 4 of these arts can be used at different levels of proficiency. Ho-Ho, if trained at a high enough level, can unlock things like Shunpo, which is what Shinigami like Yoruichi do when they move faster than the eye can see. Basically, when they look like they teleport, that's Shunpo, which is the highest application of Ho-Ho. And we've already talked about Kido, and Hakuda is pretty self-explanatory. It just leaves Zanjutsu. Now, Zanjutsu is the thing we see used most often in Bleach. Since all Shinigami have a weapon that they try to use to its max potential, and a Shinigami's weapon is referred to as a Zanpakuto. Now, going over Zanpakutos in Bankai deserves its own video, but basically, as a Shinigami trains with a Zanpakuto or their weapon, said Zanpakuto will get stronger. And as a Shinigami forms a relationship with their Zanpakuto, because the Zanpakuto is sentient, they will be able to tap into the spiritual power of said Zanpakuto. And the more of that spiritual power they can tap into, while also feeding their own spiritual power into the Zanpakuto, they're able to unleash stronger techniques, like Bankai. But there's some techniques that Shinigami simply can't use using spiritual power that other people can. Arankars and Hollows are able to use abilities like Sero and Bala, which is essentially like making a concentrated mass of spiritual power and firing it in a laser-like beam. And that is basically everything that you need to know about Bleach's power system. There is a million other things I could have talked about, and if this video does well, I will talk about them. But this video is to help those who watched Bleach when it went off the air 9 years ago remember some of the very complicated words that they may have forgotten. And if this video has helped you out at all, guys, please tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I love Bleach's power system, but there's a difference between power systems like Hunter x Hunter's, where everything makes sense and there's science behind it, and Bleach's power system, where it's a bunch of cool sounding words slapped together in a sentence.